a new podcast discovery platform, listeners switching from radio to podcasts, and Tom Webster on the current state of podcasting.
Welcome to the Richard Daly Podcast, bringing you a UK perspective on the latest news and developments from the world of podcasting and internet radio.
Welcome to episode 31. I'm your host, Richard Daly. Each week I curate and discuss the latest news in podcasting and internet radio, with a focus on the smaller podcaster, radio host and DJ. First this week, Rain News report on an interesting launch. Newmark Advertising have launched a new podcast discovery platform called PodSearch. Now, I'm not familiar with Newmark myself, but Rain News say that they're well known throughout the podcast network and production industries as one of the earliest and biggest advocates of the type of endorsement marketing that we often see in podcasting. PodSearch is described as an interactive directory for podcasts, giving people easy-to-use keyword and category search tools to find podcasts that match their interests. There's been a lot of talk about the challenges of podcast discovery and whether it's really such an issue. Now, Don Newmark from PodSearch said that the podcast industry cannot grow fast enough through word of mouth alone. Now, I could ask, is it really true that the podcast industry isn't growing fast enough? Fast enough for who? Also, is anything more than word of mouth really necessary? Anyway, PodSearch provides multiple keyword search, detailed categories and a list of newly launched shows. One feature highlighted is My PodSearch. This lets listeners generate recommendations based on category and keyword selections that match their interests. Something interesting is that the website and the PodSearch mobile app can also link to other podcast listening apps and provide information specific to those apps. Now, I did visit their website to try out the service, but you have to register, and while it's free for listeners, it costs $10 per month for podcasters to have an account. We'll have to wait and see if podcast listeners will put up with the friction of using an additional service to help them discover podcasts. Personally, I suspect not. So the last story looked at whether the podcast industry is growing fast enough. Well, we know it is growing. In fact, it's been growing steadily since it started. Now we have some stats that show that some of the listeners are coming from those who were previously only radio listeners. These statistics come from two surveys undertaken by US radio marketing and research company New Voodoo about podcast listening. Now, I'll put a link to the New Voodoo research in the show notes at richarddally.com/31, but let's look at some of the numbers. Overall, 9.5% of respondents spend at least 1 hour a day listening to podcasts. The figure for men aged 25 to 34 grew to 21.7% listening daily for at least an hour. This is significantly higher than any other group, the second highest being men aged 35 to 44 at 14.2%. According to those surveyed, the shift to more podcast listening is coming from traditional radio. Now, this is probably the key statistic from the research. 66.4% said they now listen to less traditional broadcast radio since they started listening to podcasts. The research doesn't say that the listening time is being switched on a like-for-like basis, but surely people aren't finding more time to listen to audio than before. Maybe they are. This is something that could do with being tested further for sure. A quick one now if you're looking for some reading. I've mentioned before the work being done by a team at Texas A&M University with support from DMR Interactive around podcasting. They have just published 2 new studies in their Download on Podcasting series. One is called Formats, Understanding the Structure of Podcasts, and the other study is Podcasting 411, Things You Need to Know. These are both really interesting documents and well worth the read. As always, you'll find a link in the show notes, richarddally.com/31. Now on to something that has interested me for a while. Most podcast commentators are raving about the potential for podcasting to tell stories or replace news bulletins. But for me, a huge area of potential is in talk radio. In the last year or so, we've seen some big radio personalities switch from broadcast radio to podcasting. This is certainly happening on both sides of the Atlantic, and unfortunately often seems to have been as a result of dismissals from their radio jobs, rather than purely through choice. Anyway, I believe we're starting to see a second wave of transfers, more through choice, and that this is only going to become more frequent. So why is podcasting going to be big in talk and personality? An article by Juliette de Meyer on the Atlantic.com website says it's because the intimacy of podcasting has the potential to make listeners feel things, and emotional resonance affects how people perceive information. De Meyer sees the podcast format as an antidote to some of the challenges that technology innovations have caused to journalism and its place in a democratic society in the last 20 years. Listeners, viewers and readers have access to more data, better maps, faster notifications and fact-checking, amongst many other things. The article argues that these changes have affected the role of the media as well as that of the public. The public now expects to get more information, and most want to see a clear and accurate picture of the world to help them interpret world events and become more enlightened. So why then, asks the author, instead of an enlightened group of citizens, do we find ourselves facing hateful trolls, fake news outlets and conspiracy theories galore? Well, the article gets a bit deep here, to be honest. Basically, we expect the media to be neutral, but they should also be trying to reflect the reality of the situations they report on. But for a democracy to work, its members need to feel concerned with what is happening and have issues they care about. To be affected by and concerned about these issues, you have to have some kind of experience or sensation about it, and journalism therefore needs to reflect this. De Meyer believes that podcasting provides a space for this kind of alternative, sensational vision of the role of media. Podcasts give the listener the impression of sharing in kitchen or pub table style banter with a couple of friends. Because podcasts are free from the need to provide objective or neutral reporting, podcasters can act as storytellers rather than just as journalists. As the author concludes, this is exactly the same recipe as the traditional talk radio format. Podcasting opens up the talk format to many more voices because of the low barrier to entry, and the ability to reach an audience who can listen to shows at a time that suits them rather than at a fixed time slot each week. As I said, it's quite a deep piece, but there is potential for the talk radio format to grow in podcasting. We just need to encourage more people to bring their personality and passion to the medium. Stephen Goldstein tackles a very common question among new podcasters this week. In his Blogstein column for Amplify Media, he asks, why can't music be played in podcasts? To address this question, Stephen interviewed David Oxenford, who is a partner at US law firm Wilkinson, Barker and Knauer. And I'm sure I butchered that last name, I'm sorry. I should note that while this article discusses the US situation, it is very similar in the UK. Oxenford is apparently well known in broadcasting and has a long history working with media companies. He also represents webcasters and digital media companies on copyright, music licensing and other regulatory issues. The interview looked at why is podcasting different from streaming. Basically, the difference is the rights that are involved. Streaming involves the public performance right. There are organisations in place to collect public performance royalties that cover both the musical compositions and the recorded songs. Podcasts are not viewed as public performances and are thought of as a recording of the programme. Podcast listeners make copies of the podcast programme on their phone, which is not transmitted like on a radio station, and under the US Copyright Act, a recording does not involve the public performance right, but instead the right to make reproductions of the musical work and the sound recording. The lawyer notes that there is no easy way to get a licence for podcast music rights. There are no collection agencies handling this situation. Now, I'm sure you've heard about fair use. This is the belief that it's okay to use short audio clips without permission. This concept does exist, but it is not well defined and is usually only applied to editorial use. So what about the many podcasts that do play music? Well, Goldstein asked about this and what the penalties could be. Of course, most in this group of podcasters believe that nothing will ever happen to them. But what would happen if their podcast went viral for some reason? Well, David Oxenford discusses the concept of statutory damages for copyright violation. In the US, a court will look at the infringement and can assess damages of anywhere from $500 to $150,000 per infringed song. He says that non-commercial users who are acting in good faith usually end up at the lower end of the scale, but commercial companies usually end up owing higher damages. Now, I would expect all DJs to be well aware that they should have license covering the music they are playing, so I think it's likely the courts would treat them in a similar way to commercial companies, so it could get very expensive very quickly. Stephen makes the valid point that as podcasting grows, the enforcement of copyright infringements is likely to increase as well. Oxenford then makes a great point. Recently, there have been a lot of cases where photographers have come after broadcasters for use of photographs on their websites without permission. There are a number of lawyers who specialise in these photography cases, and they spend their time searching the internet looking for infringement that they can then get a commission from litigating against. These or similar companies could easily move into looking at podcasts. So do think carefully about this if you have a music-based podcast. Lastly this week, I want to look at an article from one of the key figures involved in the podcasting industry. That's Tom Webster of Edison Research. Tom's company produces the leading industry research on the statistics around the development of podcasting. In this article for Brand Savant, Tom presents his views on the current state of podcasting. The article is a follow-up to a summit organised by AudioSearch and Nick Quah that Tom attended recently with representatives from leading networks and producers of podcasts. I'll include a link to AudioSearch's report on the event in the show notes for this episode. Tom says the meeting left him feeling very positive about podcasting and encouraged by the levels of cooperation amongst companies that could be seen as competitors in the industry. Tom listed his thoughts out in the article as follows. He feels that we're really close on metrics. He thinks that podcast metrics are already very good and that we're close to a breakthrough that will provide more of the numbers that advertisers want. He doesn't expand on that, but there are plenty of companies currently talking about improving the ability to measure how much of an episode a listener actually consumes. Tom thinks there needs to be more mainstream PR and marketing efforts from the podcasting industry to tell people exactly what podcasts are, how you can listen to them, and why they should do so. I think we're seeing this in the UK now, from the BBC in particular, with their new TV adverts. Advertising in general is also looking strong. Edison Research have done a number of campaign studies for major advertisers in the last year, and we'll be soon publishing some data on advertising in podcasts. Really looking forward to that. We really need some facts here, as there are some wild guesses being made about the monetary value of podcast advertising across the industry. Next, Webster looks at the influence outside agencies are having in promoting podcasts. He sees this as a key trend and an aid to discoverability. We know that shows from public media organisations are dominating the podcast charts, and this is in part at least because they have the ability to cross-promote each other and use their radio and TV platforms to promote and help to build an audience. Talking to new podcasters, Tom says, don't just follow the topics and formats that are trending right now. There is still plenty of room for innovation, and you don't need to be the next Serial or even sound like that kind of show. Finally, Tom notes that the Apple ecosystem still dominates podcasting, but the current market share of Apple's iPhone is less than 15%. So podcasters shouldn't forget that podcast listeners are using different devices and are different demographically. In particular, he thinks that the phrase, subscribe to us on iTunes, is getting old, and we need to start looking at other formats if we want to grow. Okay, so that's all the news from the Richard Daly podcast for this week. If you enjoyed this episode, do share it with a friend on Apple Podcasts. If you visit my website at richarddaly.com, you will find all my social media links, as well as the various ways you can subscribe to the show. The show notes for this episode are at richarddaly.com/31. As usual, please send me your questions or comments, and if there is a topic you'd like me to cover, then you can tweet me. As always, I really appreciate your feedback. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd be delighted if you would leave me a rating and review at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.